So thanks very much, Vish and Kopak and everyone for asking us to do this paper. I think this is like an emerging area of work for IEJ, so it was really great for us to have the kind of space to start to think through some of these things, and we're really looking forward to getting people's input on this. So here is the sort of overview of the paper. As you can see, it's quite long, so I'm going to try to kind of skip over some of the beginning parts, which look at the kind of diagnosis of South Africa's macroeconomy from a climate perspective. But I'm more than happy, I'll kind of just go briefly through some of that, but I'm more than happy in the questions to pick up on some of that if people would like to. So we're going to move from that to looking at some of the alternative approaches that we looked at, and then kind of put forward our positive vision. And I think that what we really started off, like the kind of basis of this paper was, as Vish and Patrick have emphasized, that there is a very big problem with the kind of dominant approaches of macroeconomics and of some of the kind of climate approaches. That many of, I can already see a typo in my slide, sorry. Many of these current approaches tend to ignore deep structural aspects of capitalism. And it is our belief, and I think Vish articulated this very well at the beginning, that these really are at the heart of the current crisis, including the climate crisis. But a lot of these other approaches also tend to kind of, so on the one hand, we have very big problems within orthodox macroeconomics. On the other hand, we also have some problems within some of the kind of dominant mainstream, like environmental movements, which tend to center the environmental at the expense of the social. And what we're really trying to do in this paper is try to say that the kind of social crises we see, the economic crises we see, the political crises we see are very intertwined with the environmental. And what we really need from our economic policy is something that can address all of those at the same time, and that recognizes these systemic contradictions and puts forward a plan which can tackle them all simultaneously. And I think that's what really a climate justice approach does differently, is recognize these links and ensure that the kind of changes that we need from an energy transition are coupled with a reversal of the kind of excluding logic of neoliberalism, because of the way in which all of this is linked. I don't think any of us on this call would want to see a kind of full resolution of the climate crisis without major social and economic changes. I would argue that that's not possible in any case. All right, so the objectives of the paper, I think, have been covered well by Vish, that we're trying to challenge dominant macroeconomic paradigms. We want to try to give expressions to the principles of climate justice within our macroeconomic framework. And we also want to try to look at what some of the international debates have been, and what the kind of global ecological critique of macroeconomic orthodoxy is, and try to say which parts of those are relevant to South Africa, which parts are not, and try to kind of grapple with some of those big debates. So we have quite a long section in the paper, which looks at South Africa's macroeconomy, which traces the kind of shift in the post-apartheid period from the kind of RDP to GEAR, and GEAR really setting us up for a lot of the problems that we see today. And really what we've kind of said is that there's three things that I think are important for us when we're trying to develop a climate justice macroeconomic policy. Three things about the South African economy, that is. And the first is that we have a highly extractive economy with unsustainably high emissions and environmentally damaging footprint. So, I mean, South Africa has, I think, we're the 14th highest emitter in the world. And that economy is also extractive in multiple ways, which is something we talk about in the paper. It's extractive from nature. It's also extractive from communities to corporations. And it's extractive from the kind of the global south, or from here to the global north a lot of the time. And that's because of an unequal global economy. South Africa also has a deindustrializing economy. So we've seen this, and a lot of the deindustrialization path underpins the massive employment crisis or unemployment crisis that South Africa has. And we have increasing precarity in livelihoods, which is as a result of high unemployment, this regime of low wages and poor social protections. So I think we really see in South Africa a crisis of both production and social reproduction, and social reproduction being this really important and something which really informs our paper, very important concept that comes from like feminist economics and from Marxist feminists in particular, which is saying that economics has largely ignored the work of social reproduction. It focuses a lot on production, which happens in, say, traditionally factories, on farms. Social reproduction is the kind of activities, the sum of all activities that go to maintaining and bringing life, right? Bringing life, and that is primarily done by women. It's typically gendered. And actually, social reproduction is incredibly important to the functioning of the economy. Social reproduction is what gets people to their offices, to their factories, to their jobs, to their farms every day. And social reproduction is also a lot about how we interact with nature. And so we really have a crisis under capitalism of social reproduction, because capitalism is so dependent on social reproduction for its success, and yet it's a system that constantly undermines our ability to reproduce. So I think that both that crisis of production and social reproduction, which are linked, underpin a lot of this kind of nature of the South African economy. And so what we did in the paper was we then said, okay, so there's a lot of people globally who are looking at alternative approaches to the macroeconomics of climate change. And we kind of pulled out 4 broad paradigms. And this is obviously paradigms perspectives from people who are trying to challenge the kind of orthodoxy, who are trying to say that we need to have a macroeconomics that accounts for the environment and that accounts for the social, so kind of progressive. I'm not always sure that I like that word, but progressive macroeconomic positions. And so what we did was we looked at 4. We looked at kind of the well-being economy approach and donut economics within that. We looked at degrowth. We looked at a kind of like left green industrialization or Green New Deal, and we looked at a rights-based economy. So what I'm going to do, we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to go like very briefly through those. And what we did in each of them was kind of outline them very relatively quickly. I'll admit there's not a lot of space to have deep dives into each, and then kind of say what some of our criticisms of this are. Obviously, this is with the view to be incorporating some of those principles in our positive vision. So this is the kind of well-being or donut economics approach, and what this really does. So there have been a lot of people who have said that the way in which we base our economic policy on growth, on increasing GDP, very narrowly defined, is wrong. And that we really need to ask ourselves, what is an economy for, right? What should economic policy do? And what should be the metrics of success for our economic policy? And I think that's really, really important. And it's something that kind of frames the rest of our paper. And what this paradigm says is that rather than focusing on something like economic growth as the objective of our economic policy, we should be focusing on something like well-being, right? Human well-being. And so this kind of shifts us away from this narrow growth focus. And it forces us to embed our notions of economics within society and nature. And you'll see this diagram on the right-hand side is something developed by Kate Raworth in her book, Donut Economics. And what she does there is say, what we should be doing what we should be doing is basing our economic policies on living within the donut. So that's the kind of lighter green space here. She puts forward a social foundation. So that's the way in which all of people's people are given the means to flourish, but it's within planetary boundaries. And that's the ecological ceiling. And I think this is a very useful book. I have a friend who is a high school biology teacher who told me that he's using that in teaching biology, which I think is really great and like shows the value of putting forward things in very simple and easy to understand ways, and kind of telling a story and the importance of like drawing these pictures that can help us to understand this. Which is something that mainstream economics doesn't like to do very well. But I think within this paradigm, there's some critiques of it. There's the question of what is the normative basis for well-being. yeah, so the social foundation, like what determines the things that we understand to be needed for human flourishing? On what do we base that? And there's also been a critique of this book that it has a kind of lack of a political economy focus, that there's not a clear focus on kind of class contradictions within this. One of the critiques that I read said, you know, in the book, Kate Raworth uses we a lot, as if there's like this we without any kind of like contradictions within it. The next thing, approach that we looked at was degrowth, which has been mentioned a couple of times already, I think. And degrowth has been something that has evolved, if I'm correct, out of ecological economics. And the degrowth paradigm sees growth as a central problem, because growth drives up energy demand, that economic growth causes rising incomes, that leads to added consumption, which drives up energy demand. Also, that when we're centering growth, we often have, you know, heavy kind of productive capacity within that, which can lead to higher emissions. And so within this paradigm, there's an argument for kind of planned reductions in economic growth. A lot of the time, there's a very important, I think, stated commitment towards equity and redistribution, right, which features in most advocates of degrowth, which say that, okay, we understand that some people in the economy don't have enough. And so what we want to do in having aggregate degrowth is to redistribute. Within this paradigm, there's also often a skepticism regarding technology and its role in tackling the climate crisis. And there's a lot of attention, I think, within this. One of the reasons is about like scale. And there's a lot of emphasis on small scale solutions rather than like large scale solutions. I think within this, some of the problems I have with the degrowth paradigm is that I'm not sure how politically feasible it is to be arguing on the basis of degrowth. I think in particular in countries in the global south, but even within the global north, there's a lot of people who have really seen the kind of ravages of austerity and don't have enough. And so to kind of base a political platform on having less, I think is quite difficult. And there's also reasons why we would not want people to have less. I think there's like an incompatibility of the demands of this with the kind of need for a renewable energy transition and the expansion of public services, which are two things we'll speak about in a bit, but that necessarily requires like massive growth, because you're going to build new solar farms, build new wind farms. There's all the inputs necessary for that. Also, with an expansion of public services, there's a whole range of things that are kind of going to stimulate the economy. Of course, there are also parts of the economy that we really want to shut down, namely those that are reliant on fossil fuels. And there's also been a critique of the degrowth paradigm, in particular from like feminist economists and feminist activists, which says that degrowth doesn't necessarily understand the reproductive burdens of such a program. And there's a criticism on the kind of productive burden that this program brings, because it doesn't recognize how our kind of increased productivity that comes with economic growth has really, made it easier for workers in some senses. So those are some of the criticisms. Then there's the kind of green industrialization or Green New Deal program. And I think it's important here to distinguish from green capitalist approaches, which kind of leave the current system in place. And what a Green New Deal tries to do is say, well, what we want to do is kind of utilize the climate crisis and like this current moment that demands a change to really like completely change the way in which our economy and our society is structured. And that's around like a coherent national centralized economic plan. So we've seen this obviously in particular in the US and the UK around a kind of plan a Green New Deal is featured very strongly within both of those countries. So it's like a coherent national centralized plan. Obviously, this is harking back to like the New Deal in the US. It centers politics and people in the plan to decarbonize. So it tries to distinguish itself from like technical or wonky approaches. And that's usually through the provision of public goods. And so that's public transport. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. It also sees these crises as interconnected. So what it says is that, yes, we need to have massive decarbonization, but that also needs to come with really improving people's lives. And because we have this kind of triple crisis, inequality, poverty, and the climate crisis. And so there's a clear link here between decarbonization and public goods provisioning, and there's a strong role for industrial policy, which is linked to both of those. There have also been critiques of the Green New Deal. There's critiques of it from the perspective, from a kind of left perspective, that a Green New Deal would just kind of amount to kind of like a greening of the current system, that it doesn't go far enough in kind of bringing about a socialist future. There's also critiques of it on the basis of how it doesn't necessarily account for ecological crises beyond the climate crisis. And there's also been some critiques of, obviously there's different versions of this, but there have been critiques of this from feminists also, which for kind of very productivist focused Green New Deal plans that don't account for like the care economy, for example. Right, so time goes very quickly. So I think what we really did after like reviewing these different approaches is to think about, the rights-based one, this is my last one. So a rights-based economy is something that is perhaps less known to people, maybe not, but it's something that we've been thinking about a lot at the IEJ with some of our partners. And this is really this idea that well, you can see there on the screen, the rationale for a rights-based economy is to guarantee the material, social, and environmental conditions necessary for all people to live with dignity on a flourishing planet. But what it says is that we already have the frameworks necessary or to like guide this process, and that is within our like human rights paradigm. And it says that we've had obviously in South Africa, we have this strong constitution that enshrines all these rights. Internationally, we have a whole range of human rights treaties and human rights instruments that set out the parameters for what like a good and sustainable life looks like. And yet those don't seem to necessarily be always implemented. And one of the arguments within this kind of paradigm is that a lot of that is because the human rights community has ignored economics and economics has ignored human rights. And so what we're really trying to do here is bring these different fields together. And the idea is that rights can be really important, both conceptually, normatively, methodologically, and strategically. And I'd be happy to go into that in the question and answer session if people are interested in it. But it's basically saying we can use rights as that kind of normative underpinning of what we saw in the donut, which was the need for social needs. Okay. So taking from that, what we did was we said, well, what would it mean to have a kind of climate just macroeconomic framework? And what we said is it would be a care-centered, ecologically sustainable, and rights-based macroeconomic policy. So what I'm just going to do is kind of, and so this is obviously a broad approach, and it's kind of what we've done is centered on like a mission, and then said what principles do we need to base our policy on to achieve that mission, and then what are some of the kinds of policies that we need in order to affect that. So this idea of the mission was something I thought about because I listened to a really great interview with the economic historian Adam Tooze, where he was asked about, he was talking about the Biden climate and infrastructure plans. And he was asked, what would you need to do to have when you're developing a macroeconomic framework in light of the climate crisis. And so he says this there: separate out your fiscal policy decisions, prioritize your fiscal policy spending according to what you think your mission should accomplish, and view them as cold-eyed as you can. And then think about the social coalitions you need to get there or not, and figure out your other agenda, which is creating a just society using the tools we have, and then solve the equation that allows you to do both at the same time, right? And so what I like about this is it's forcing us to say, like, what is our overall mission, right? And let's try to take our policy decisions and our building of our coalitions and gear them really strongly towards this mission. So in South Africa, what I think our mission should be is to drastically alter the unequal social and economic relations between people, ensure that people are given the means to flourish, rapidly change our energy sources, and then ensure a more sustainable mode of production. So it's kind of like the mission is equal to structural transformation plus environmental sustainability plus rights realization. And that mission should guide all of our kind of policy interventions and all of our politics, how we build coalitions, what we build them around, what we argue for. And so from that, what we did is we said, we need to, sorry, I'm just checking my timing. We have these kind of principles that we need to have, and you can see them here. So the first is have human well-being as the goal and set in metrics of success, using rights realization to underpin this. And a metric of success is really important because it needs to determine what our policy aims towards, and that should cascade in other interventions. We think this should be centered on green structural transformation, which requires sectoral diversification that's aimed at addressing the climate ecological crises and shifting the mineral and energy complex structure of South Africa's economy. This must involve a coordinated and holistic approach to economic policy making. So we need to have a clear link between the macroeconomic framework we have and these other policy areas. And these all need to be geared towards the mission using both short and long-term measures. So I think a lot of the time when you read critiques of various elements of South Africa's policies, a lot of the time people say there's just no policy coherence, there's like this. And one of the big problems, which we talk about in the kind of context part of the paper, a big problem with our macroeconomic framework since in the post-apartheid period has been that it doesn't necessarily support the other kind of policy goals that we have. And often these things are fighting with each other. The next thing is that it must integrate an understanding of social reproduction and be supportive of the care economy. I think that's really important, both to like human well-being, but also to the environment. There's very clear links between this. It must recognize the importance of technological solutions to the climate and ecological crisis, but it must integrate these with an understanding of politics and the necessity of changing power relations. And so what that principle is trying to get at is that we think that there's an important role for technology here, but that we can't think that just techno fixes are going to solve our crises, because they can't. So we need to integrate our kind of use of technology with a kind of political understanding. And not having a kind of apolitical technocratic approach to this. We should make sure that it ensures the stability of livelihoods and the realization of a dignified life. And it must encompass and envision active role for planning and for the state. And I'm very aware of my timing, but I think what's really important, and there's more of this in the section, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A, but what we've also tried to do in this kind of principles section is say, we need to push back against some of the kind of conceptualizations that go with orthodox macroeconomic policy. So for example, a lot of the time, you'll hear Tito and Mboweni talk about this a lot, the need for stability. And what is stability? Well, stability within a traditional orthodox macroeconomic context is, low inflation. I think I've actually got this here, low inflation, low debt, moderate tax levels, liberalized markets, stable spending, right? And what we need is, and actually what a lot of those policies do is lead to a great deal of instability. They lead to environmental instability, it leads to political instability, to social instability. And I think we've seen that in South Africa. With the policy, we've seen that with structural adjustment programs, with the kind of post-financial crisis austerity programs in Greece and elsewhere, that actually there's a great deal of instability that comes from these. And so what we need to do is say, we need to redefine stability as something that recognizes social and environmental imperatives. Similarly, with strong and stable growth, this is typically understood as continuous growth, which is undifferentiated. As long as there's growth, we could be having hundreds and hundreds of car accidents, which will increase economic growth. It doesn't matter. And sustainable growth, which is understood as growth without high inflation, to a notion of strong and sustainable growth, which means growth that's supportive of rights realization and improved equitable well-being. I need to proofread these slides. That would be the strong part, and prioritize low carbon activities for recreation, employment, and production, which to me would be the sustainable part. So what a lot of this is about changing the way in which we understand these kind of like terms and principles, and really like turning them on their head and redefining them. And this is also about shifting our understanding of the role that macroeconomic policy can play, so that it's not something that's largely static, around which these other sectoral policies are adapted and shifted, but actually something like quite fundamental to the changing of our economy, and something that's fundamental to addressing the climate crisis, and should have a kind of very strong normative element to it. So I'll try to go through these. Vish, will you just let me know when I'm close to time going up?
3 more minutes.
Okay, I'll go through these really quickly, and then hopefully we can, if people want to pick up one of these in particular and talk about them. So from that, what we say is that we need to kind of address fiscal and monetary policy measures in line with these principles. And we also have to have a strong role for industrial policy. So with fiscal policy, looking at expenditure, the level of government spending must increase, the composition of spending should shift so that adequate resources are channeled to climate-friendly infrastructure development, and we should consider the distributional impacts. And that requires a short-term fiscal stimulus and a medium to long-term plan which complements this. And so some of the things that we talk about where expenditures should be targeted: public employment schemes for care and for nature. I won't go into these. I think they're probably fairly self-explanatory, but just that we think that public employment schemes for care are really important. They help, they generally provide low carbon jobs that improve people's well-being, improve people's lives. Public employment scheme for nature can be about carbon sequestration projects, energy and water efficiency projects, community gardens, and obviously then you're addressing the employment problem, which can help to stimulate aggregate demand. And there's a whole range of kind of knock-on effects that come from this. Investment in an expansion of public goods and services. So my IEJ colleagues who are here will laugh because I really like talking about public affluence a lot, and they say I talk about it too much. But it's like a building out of the access to public goods and services, which I think can complement these public employment schemes and are integrated in an reinvigorated industrial policy. And so two, I think which I think Vish, you already mentioned these, two of the most obvious, or the ones that I feel most passionate about, are about expanding public housing and expanding public transport. And I think that if we take transport, for example, expanding public transport cuts down on the number of cars that are on the road. It cuts down on our time spent in traffic. It cuts down on emissions. It can help people to get to work. It can address spatial inequalities. So there's a whole range of ways in which expanding, and if we have a solid industrial policy, what it can do is stimulate jobs in the production of, for example, electric buses. And I think what you said earlier, Vish, about this kind of focus on electric vehicles, there's no account for buses. I think I think that's really important, because what we don't want to see is every single person having like a Tesla car, right? What we want to see is having a whole fleet of buses that people are using and far less cars on the road. And I think that that's like a really important element to this. Sorry, I'm going so quickly, but we can pick it up hopefully. Targeted investment, better and more comprehensive social protections. I won't go into the UBIG because I know we're going to have a whole session on this later, but I think this is really important in like the shifting of capital and labor relations, and it can protect the livelihoods of workers in the coal sector, especially during a transition. And there's a whole range of really important implications that a UBIG can have. With taxation, so we've talked about a whole taxation, I think, can play a really important role across these kind of 4 dimensions, which is revenue, repricing, redistribution, and representations or rebalancing power dynamics. And so in terms of revenue, often people say, well, how are we going to pay for all of this? And I think there's a whole range of taxes and taxation measures that we can introduce. We need a wealth tax, and there's been a lot of really good research lately on how much a wealth tax can generate for South Africa. We need a tax on environmentally damaging behaviors. So that's a carbon tax, for example, other taxes on pollutions. I think it's really important to think also about what kinds of rebates we need, so that taxes on carbon are not regressive and they don't fall on the backs of poor people. We need a resource rent tax. We need to reduce tax breaks on fossil fuels. We need a global wealth tax, and we need a global minimum corporate tax rate. So we can talk all about that. And I think taxation is important because it's not just about revenue raising, it's also about repricing, which is changing people's behaviors through pricing, and it's about redistribution. So there's obviously this important principle that the rich must pay their ecological debt. Also in South Africa, we have a highly unequal country, and we need to start to change that because, and this is the last point there, this can help us with changing how representation works and rebalancing power dynamics. These are the fiscal principles for South Africa. Right now, South Africa has adopted fiscal rules, which set very, very strict debt ceiling levels, which will essentially result in massive budget cuts in the next few years. And what we're saying is that rather than having these kind of arbitrary fiscal rules, we should have fiscal principles for South Africa. And all of our fiscal spending should adhere to these principles. Rights realization, maximum domestic resource mobilization, debt sustainability must take account of rights, and there's really good human rights frameworks that help us to know what that is. And environmental sustainability must be a constraint to and a goal of fiscal spending. And that this could mean that we could have targets that develop from that. Government capital expenditure targeted at green infrastructure that helps rights realization, government consumption expenditure targeted at green jobs and services. Government consumption expenditure could be based on green procurement. So we could have climate requirements just like we have with the broad-based economic empowerment, Black economic empowerment. Monetary policy, we need to change our monetary policy framework. And I'm sure like Duma will talk a lot more about this. He's much more of an expert on this than I am. But I think we need to change our monetary policy and the role of the Reserve Bank. And one of the things we need to do is to shift away from a narrow inflation targeting to a mandate for the central bank, which is supportive of this overall mission, right? And thus accounts for both employment and sustainability. And I think there's ways in which, there's very clear ways in which we can do that. And there is a shift to this internationally. We can use monetary policy to reduce the cost of borrowing, which can help us to fund some of the measures that I've outlined above. We can have better direct financing via monetary policy to green investments. We can have the central bank directly finance government, development finance institutions, and state-owned enterprises, as long as there are strong conditionalities aimed at the overall mission. I was listening to a very good talk by Mariana Mazzucato and others earlier in the week in UNCTAD report, where she specifically spoke about Eskom and saying that Eskom in South Africa, gets all this money from Treasury without any of the kind of conditionalities needed to force a transition. And I think we should really be thinking about that. We can change some of the other regulation with the SARP. We can introduce prescribed assets to ensure a certain level of investment in green infrastructure projects. We can have better disclosure mechanisms for the financial risks associated with climate crisis, and we can have more stable integration into the global financial system, which is really important to ensuring that all of this happens. And we could use capital controls for that. I'm nearly done. Industrial restructuring. So I think a lot of what I've spoken about requires a really strong industrial policy, and that this must be supportive of our macroeconomic framework as a driver for green and structural transformation. There's estimates that say about 2% of GDP should go to renewable energy, and that this should be a big part of that. An industrial policy must be tailored to the needs of the climate crisis by building resilience in two senses. So we should have resilience that's directly linked to the climate crisis, and industrial policy that focuses on improving our energy efficiency. That's about renewables. It's also about building out public transport, retrofitting houses so that they're more energy efficient. And we can have a policy that's linked to changing in our agricultural production. So energy and agriculture are our two biggest emission sources. And then at sectoral diversification. So that's about making our economy more resilient to major shocks. We saw with the COVID-19 crisis, the way in which once global value chains were interrupted, that really a lot of people's economies were not at all resilient. And this will also require localization projects, localization legislation that is aimed at a specific kind of well thought out areas that are linked again in with the need for environmental sustainability and rights realization. And so I'll leave it there. I think what we'd just like to say also is that it's really important to build broad coalitions around this kind of thing and to consider the political economy aspect of it. Of course, that's why if it's like the climate justice Charter are really important because they brought together all these different groups, and that we need to think about how we take our macroeconomic policy to these groups and how we kind of build support for this. And I think what's really important is to kind of change what is seen as common sense. So I believe strongly in the importance of telling like a powerful story. And I think that that is applies as much to economic policy as to anything else, that our economic policy must inspire people, must be telling a story, and must be trying to change the way in which we see what is like economic common sense. Sorry, I spoke very quickly at the end. I'll end this, and then we can hopefully pick up some of these things in questions.
Thanks. Over to you, Charles, to give a few comments, and then we'll open it up further.
Thank you very much, Vish, and thank you very much, Carilee, for that very wonderful presentation. Just have a few points to raise. In your analysis of South Africa's macroeconomic policy and the minerals energy complex, you do point out that it has resulted in very unequal wealth distribution as well as ecological damage. But what I would like to know, I think it's something that Vish also raises at the beginning. Like, what is the ecological debt that is owed by the rich who have benefited from ecological destruction? If you are saying that the rich must pay their ecological debt, like in monetary terms, how would you go about sort of measuring that? If you could say something around that. And also, if you could say something about carbon lock-ins, since South Africa's economy is dependent on fossil fuels, I would love if you go in terms of how carbon are continuing to be locked in terms of our economic policy. And the third thing is, you did correctly point out that South Africa's post-apartheid economy has been basically neoliberal. But this neoliberalism is embedded in our laws. So if you could say something about that, the embedding of these neoliberal policies in our laws and in our macroeconomic policy. Also, you've also pointed out that GEA cements an economic policy that transfers value from one group to another. And you talk of transferring value from communities to corporates. I think it's a very important argument, but in the paper, if you could put in some figures and examples of how that is happening, transferring of value from communities to corporates, transferring of value from one group to another. So if you could bring in some examples there, I think it would really help to strengthen the argument in the paper. Also, you've argued that the Reserve Bank mandate has been to keep interest rates within a band of 3 to 6%. In the paper, it would be very nice if you could elaborate on this a little bit. Why is this so, and how do we change it? Also, Oxfam said that carbon emissions, if they continue in their current trajectory, they are going to cost G7 countries about $4.8 trillion a year. So if you could help us think, what is the cost of the climate crisis in South Africa? And what is the projection, for example, for the next 10 years? How much is the climate crisis going to cost our economy in the next 10 years? Also, in analyzing Kate Raworth's donut economics, I would like it if you can highlight some of the planetary boundaries that have been transgressed in South Africa, as well as their impact on our economy. Well, what are some of these planetary boundaries that have been transgressed in South Africa, and what has been the impact of that in our economy? I think it's similar to something that was raised before about some of the impact of droughts, the impact of polluting our water systems and all of that. And also in terms of public employment schemes for care and for nature, I would really love if you could elaborate more on some of those programs, what they would look like, how they constitute climate jobs and all that. The role of democratic planning as one of the key pillars of the deep just transition, and it's also essential for a climate justice deal. So if you could go on, say something about the role of democratic planning in a rights-based economy, what democratic planning would look like. And also, if you could go on also and argue on how mass consumption is implicated in the ecological crisis. How is mass consumption implicated in the ecological crisis, and how do we reimagine that? Or what are the alternatives to that? Or how do we deal with that mass consumption? You did mention agriculture, but I would also like if you could go into the intersectoral linkage of agriculture to the broader macroeconomic analysis. And finally, just two more things. Can the informal economy be left out? What do we do about the informal economy? And then lastly, what would be the impact of removing VAT on all food items?
Okay, thanks, Charles. So Carilee, you can respond to that briefly, and then we'll open it up. We have till 20 past, I think, for others to participate. Okay.
Thanks, Charles. So I think a lot of those are really, really useful, and are not all of them are possible for me to respond to now, but will obviously be thought about in future, like in the kind of revision of this. And I think a lot of them are really, really useful, in particular around kind of like putting some numbers and figures and some more examples. There's obviously a balance between trying to provide like scope and depth. So I think it's really useful to have an indication of where you would like more detail. I think one thing I would like to say is you spoke about neoliberalism being embedded in our laws and our macro policy. And I think what's really interesting about that is that it's true that neoliberalism is embedded in the kind of like policies that we've put forward, but actually it's not embedded in our laws as such. And actually the Constitution of South Africa requires us to account for rights and requires us to account for socioeconomic rights. And that is something that the South African government has not been doing. That's something that if you look at our budget, if you look at our like if you look at the MTEF, there's no real consideration for how these things will impact on rights. And actually that is required by the Constitution. And so I think that's something we really want to try to push. I mean, obviously that's talked about here in terms of the rights-based economy, but it's something that we really want to try to push, like as an institution. It's one of my other projects on linking economics and human rights, and really showing the fact that the South African government actually has rights obligations in terms of South Africa and in terms of our international human rights commitments to be doing very different things with our economic policy and to be accounting for rights realization in our economic policy. And it's astounding because you saw Tito Mboweni in a post-budget press conference essentially saying, sorry, that's a different point. You saw in Treasury's budget a recognition by them that cuts to education were going to be a rollback of rights in terms of your right to education. So I think that's really important to emphasize that actually we should be very clear that the law does actually require the government to be doing very different things from what they're doing. Duma, did you want to say something on that? You're unmuted. No, okay. So thank you. I don't know if I want to take some other questions. I've written down all of these points. Vish, I don't know if you want me to respond more or try to balance
that's fine.
others. Yeah.
That's fine. Can I think Duma or somebody, whoever you have your speaker on, please mute.
Okay, can you hear me though?
Yeah, we can hear you. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, no. I'll tell you why. Yeah.
Okay. All right, so we have two hands up. We have Dr. Matabula and then Michelle. Dr. Matabula, you want to say something? Dr. Matabula? Okay, not there. Michelle, over to you. Let's not waste time.
Okay, thanks. I have a number of questions, and you might not be able to answer them right now, but I perhaps in your paper, you guys can develop these. So first of all, I'm very suspicious of technological solutions to climate crisis. So I'd like you guys to unpack what exactly you're talking about here. Because more and more as I look at this, and this links to some of the other questions I have, I'm not sure that we can continue having the kind of economy that we've had for the last 200 years. And so, and I know as economists, this is hard to think, and it's not fair to ask you to perhaps think beyond our economic kind of basis of this economy. But as you were talking, some of it sounded, I'm not sure exactly what your suggestions would look like and how different they would really be. So for instance, I'm not sure what a sustainable mode of production would entail under your guys's vision. And is it really something very different than what we have right now? Or is it just a bit cleaner and a bit greener? Or is it fundamentally different? And so, and I liked your principles and visions. I don't have a problem with it, but I don't see it as being really that different than where we are. So, for instance, carbon sequestration, energy, water efficiency, community gardens, that's fantastic. But is that really central? How does that relate to your reprioritizing industrial policy? Or these things that you just do on the side that look good and green? Like what exactly, when you reprioritize industrial policy, makes it fundamentally different and help us resolve both the inequality issues, the social issues, but the ecological issues? And you talked about restructuring energy and agriculture, and those are fundamental, and localization is fundamental. But I'm still struggling to understand what kind of economy we should have if we really want to get to a transformative position. And I'm not sure that what you guys have presented is enough. I don't think you go far enough. I think you have to start thinking much more radically differently about the basis of our economic activity, and even if we can have the type of economic activity. And I think it's interesting because it took me a while to get there, but I think the degrowth stuff actually is challenging us in that way. Can we keep having growth given the ecological kind of limits of our planet? And if we don't have growth, can you have capitalism? So these are fundamental questions that I think we're skirting around, but I think we need to ask them. And then just two other, they're big questions, but these are just two separate points. Much of what you talk about requires remaking the state, which I agree, we have to remake the state. But I want to hear you guys say, what do you think we need to, what do we do? How do we do this? What would be the kind of priorities in remaking the state? And then the second thing, and I was touched on it, but I want to make a slightly different point about the carbon lock-ins. Unions are a big part of that lock-in with carbon, and we've seen that in the coal sector. But we've also seen that many unions have actually become anti-developmental. They prevent a lot of developmental policies from, or good ecological policies from going into existence. For instance, I had someone who I won't even name the union, but they were telling me instead of public transport, their members actually are always making them demand car allowances. So how do we deal with the reality is that many of our unions are no longer thinking about public goods and the social wage, and how do we then get them to play a developmental role? I'm saying that because you list them as being an important actor, but I'm not sure that they're always going to be allies in the way we might hope that they would be, and that they may have been in the past.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. There's a comment from Patrick about the Constitution and the weasel words within available resources. Is there any other comments before we give Carilee a chance to respond? I'd like to add 1 or 2 points. Is there anybody else who wants to go before me? Okay, if not, Carilee, just a couple of issues. I mean, the one is, just to reemphasize what Charles was saying, you in the way you look at neoliberalism's impact and consequences for nature, it'd be good to have more detail there and more, Patrick's done work on unequal ecological exchange and so on. But if you all can really give us more empirical data, that'll be helpful. Now, the issue of growth, your paper provides a nice sort of strident critique of degrowth. And I think that's welcome. But on the other hand, there's been some interesting stuff in the global south. So Amartya Sen's work on human development, particularly in relation to Kerala, is very interesting. And there they did not prioritize growth, they invested in people. And that wasn't asking people to have a impoverished life. That was about supporting and enabling people to have a richer life, and a literate life, an educated life, training opportunities, etc., etc., and housing, education, things like that. So there's something to think about there regarding growth and human flourishing. I mean, the issue of consumption. I mean, the issue of mass scale consumption is a very important issue here, and we can't have mass-based industrial consumer societies anymore. I mean, there are ecological limits. And so how do we think about the consumption issue? So, you lead to care, but maybe we also need to be thinking about investments in cultural infrastructures too, so that we do create a more de-alienated society, and that people have other ways of understanding the richness of their lives. And so it's not just, you shop and you buy commodities and so on. So that, I think, is also very, very important. I mean, the issue around, 20th century industrialism, and I'm not saying you're arguing that, and even greening that kind of industrialism, but literature and what we've learned is that, we've got to be more modest about industrial development and industrial policy. We're living in a completely different context. I mean, China, with its low wage manufacturing economy, has captured a lot of manufacturing, global value chains, the role of new technologies, etc. So the way we bring back industrial policy, we cannot see it as a silver bullet and the panacea anymore. This is post 20th century industrial capitalism, but that doesn't mean there isn't a role for industrial policy. But this also relates, so it's not going to have the labor absorption effects that we expect and so on. But at the same time, even if we go this route and we're very clear about the sources of growth and what we're going to industrialize, hopefully with clean energy, there is also the question of throughput, of energy and material resources. And this is where the issue of working time becomes absolutely important from an ecological point of view, but also breaking the link with mass-based consumption. Because maybe as part of this climate justice deal, besides wanting decent climate jobs as part of a sort of green industrial strategy, you also want the labor time gains of productivity to be given to workers. So in other words, it may not be about financial rewards, but you'll get less time to work, basically. So in other words, you'll have more leisure time, okay, in society. And I think we've got to start thinking a bit more creatively about this nexus of things in industrial policy, because if you're empowering the working class, not just to consume based on productivity gains, but to have a more quality existence, you are managing the throughput of energy and resources from an ecological economics point of view. So we need to be a bit more creative then. It'd be nice to see if IEJ could come up with more details around these kinds of proposals, but I'll stop there. Yeah. So final comments, and then we wrap up. Carilee? Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know if you wanted others to come in. Thanks, everyone. That's it's a lot. I got lots and lots of notes, and I think we'll really account for all of that. I mean, there's like 2 minutes left to respond to like some really big things, but and I will really like take on board a lot of that and try to flesh this out in our piece. What I will say just on your kind of last points there, Vish, is that I guess that probably doesn't come across as much in this paper, but I'm very on board with what you're saying about changing the way in which we like what kinds of consumption we have, and I'm really I think there's a lot we can do to indicate that a bit more in this paper about the need to give people more time and then provide them with better, more ecologically sound things to do with that time. And so one of the things, we talk about the public employment program for care, like one of the things I'd mentioned there, but it's just in passing and it can get expanded, was, about like broader, like recreational, like theater and like theater programs, like music programs, all of these kinds of like low carbon activities that take people, as you say, like out of shopping malls, out of this, and are like very important for well-being. And I think that's why like we kind of talk a lot about human well-being. I don't think well-being, well-being doesn't depend on like how many like coats or like pairs of shoes or whatever you have. It is like a much more holistic thing, but I guess we need to like emphasize that a little bit more in the paper and make that a bit clearer. I don't know if you want me to say any more, like there's some big questions here, but I think it's really useful. And I think, Michelle, your point about degrowth, I mean, I think that degrowth is really, I like have found reading the degrowth literature useful in like pushing me to think more about this. But I guess for me, and like, can we keep having this kind of growth? And if we don't have growth, can we have capitalism? I think those are really, really important questions. And I'll definitely try to like grapple a little bit more with the like mode of production, like what a sustainable mode of production looks like. I think my problem with the degrowth perspective is that it's almost like a little bit of like a maybe red herring is not the right word, but if we focus a political project just on degrowth, I think that we risk losing people politically, but also risk not building something that we really want, right? So and I think that a good illustration of this is, last year essentially we had like in some countries global degrowth at certain points because of the COVID crisis, right? We had to shut down production, we had to stop people from consuming, and there were actually like really significant like negative impacts, and there was a cut in carbon emissions from that, right? I think something like 5%, and the result of that was a lot more poverty, unemployment, and a great deal of like social strife, right? And all right, yes. Is Duma saying something to me? I don't know. Sorry. And a great deal of social strife. And so for me, I think that what we need to do is say, so I guess, sorry, that just like threw me off. So I guess that what for me, degrowth as a like objective commits the same kind of problems that the kind of growth perspective commits, in like focusing solely on that, rather than on, we could, we had a cutting in growth and we had a cut in emissions, but we also had like a massive social misery as a result. And so rather, I would say we need to try to say, well, what kinds of things do we want to grow and what do we want to cut? And rather think about it in that way. Sorry, that maybe it's not the best response, but thank you all for these comments, and I'll really try to incorporate these into our revision. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carilee, for your paper and for the engagement. And yeah, I mean, we'll come back to some of these issues. I'm sure that these themes are going to run through the rest of the workshop.